They said she was just a supply clerk, the kind of soldier who'd never see the front lines. At least, that's what the recruits whispered as they passed her in the dim prep room, where the smell of gun oil hung thick in the air. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She only bent her head lower and ran her fingers along the belts of ammunition stretched out before her, each link heavy with quiet consequence. And when the day finally came that someone opened the old black case hidden under her bunk, years later, they found medals they couldn't name and a letter signed by a general whose name had long been carved into history. If you agree that not every hero wears their story on their sleeve, make sure to like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a story of patience, precision, and the kind of courage that doesn't always make the headlines. Elena Marquez was 28 years old, and she spent most of her nights in the kind of silence only broken by the click of brass rounds against steel trays. In the far corner of the armory, she had claimed a workstation, not by choice, but because nobody else wanted it. The fluorescent bulbs above flickered with a constant hum, and the ventilation fan rattled against the ductwork like a tired old drum. To the others, it was a miserable detail, one that came with no glory and even less recognition. To Elena, it was everything. She moved her hands with a surgeon's precision, eyes narrowing as she checked every cartridge, every belt feed, every link in the chain of firepower that would one day be trusted in combat. She didn't talk much. The younger soldiers, 19, maybe 20, filled the room with their banter. They joked, complained, bragged about things that hadn't happened. When they passed her table, some laughed under their breath. "Marquez takes this too seriously," they muttered. "She thinks she's saving the world with a magnifying glass." But Elena never looked up. Her late 20s had taught her something they hadn't yet learned. Most mistakes don't look like mistakes until it's too late. A hairline crack in a casing, a stiff link in a belt, small things, invisible in the rush of excitement. But she knew what they meant. A jammed weapon at the wrong second. A soldier who never made it back. Her father used to tell her that soldiers came in two kinds: the ones who fired the rounds, and the ones who made sure the rounds could be fired. "Both matter, Mija," he'd said when she was younger, pressing an old medal into her hand. She was just a teenager then, restless, fiery, dreaming of uniforms and front lines. Now, almost 30, she understood what he had meant. On nights when the barracks slept, she often stayed behind, her fingertips blackened from powder residue, her eyes stinging from the fluorescent light. She would take the belts apart link by link, sometimes reassembling them twice, just to be certain. To the casual eye, it was obsession. To her, it was insurance, not for herself, but for the voices she'd overheard earlier in the day. The nervous kid writing a letter home, the woman showing off her engagement ring, the corporal saving up for his first car. They would never know her name, never think about the hands that kept their weapons from betraying them. That was fine with Elena. But there was another reason she worked so hard, a reason she never said aloud. Years ago, before she was just the ammo checker, she had been recruited into something else, a training program she wasn't supposed to talk about, a role she wasn't supposed to admit. That part of her life was buried under secrecy and silence. But the habits had stayed. The discipline, the way her eyes swept the room for exits, the way her ears never missed a change in tone. Even in the dull repetition of ammo inspection, she carried herself like someone waiting for a signal. Some nights, when the noise of the others faded and she was finally alone, she'd allow herself to imagine it. The moment her call sign would come back. Obsidian Wren. Words that felt sharp and heavy. Words she hadn't heard in years. She told herself it would never happen again, that her life was smaller now, simpler. But in the deepest corners of her mind, she knew that soldiers like her didn't just fade into the background. Not forever. One evening, long before the orders that would change everything, she sat with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, carefully aligning a fresh belt of 7.62 rounds across the table. She paused at a small imperfection, tilting the brass under the light, running her thumb along the groove until she found the faintest dent. Most would have missed it. She set it aside, not with frustration, but with respect, a quiet acknowledgement that something unfit for battle had been spared from costing someone their life. She continued, methodical, calm, the rhythm of her work like a heartbeat. It was easy, in those hours, to forget the world beyond the armory walls. Easy to forget that somewhere out there, people were fighting, waiting, depending on belts like these. Easy, too, to forget that she was 28, and most of the soldiers around her had already started calling her old. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had more training, more experience, more nights spent hunched over metal and steel than most of them would ever know. But in the barracks, she was just Marquez, the quiet one, the perfectionist, the one who never smiled, never joined their games. And yet, in that silence, she held a kind of power none of them could see. Because Elena Marquez knew something they didn't. Wars are not only won on the battlefield. They're won in the shadows, in the unnoticed work, in the moments when one pair of careful hands keeps a chain of events from breaking. That night, as she stacked the finished belts into crates and wiped the residue from her fingers, the echo of boots rang faintly in the corridor. She didn't look up. Not yet. Not until the sound drew closer, steady, deliberate. The sergeant. But he wouldn't speak to her tonight. Not yet. For now, there was only the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the weight of the work no one else wanted. Elena lowered her gaze back to the steel table, running her fingertips across the smooth metal. This was where her story began, though she didn't know it yet. And when the day came that her name, her real name, her call sign, would be spoken again, she would remember these quiet nights. The patience, the discipline, the weight of every unnoticed choice. Because hidden in those endless hours of checking and rechecking was the truth of who she really was. Not just a clerk, not just a woman in her late 20s checking ammo belts, but something waiting, coiled, ready. That night, the sound of boots on the concrete wasn't like the others. It wasn't the hurried shuffle of recruits sneaking in late, or the uneven gait of someone who'd had too much at the canteen. It was slower, heavier, intentional. Elena didn't need to look up to know who it was. The weight of the steps alone told her. The sergeant. He stopped just inside the doorway, saying nothing at first. The younger soldiers nearby straightened in their chairs, their laughter dying down into nervous silence. There was something about him that always cut the air in half, a sharpness in his presence that didn't need words. But this time, he didn't scold them. He didn't bark orders. Instead, his eyes tracked across the room until they landed on Elena. She kept her gaze low, finishing the round she was inspecting, clicking it carefully into place on the belt. She felt his stare long before he spoke. And when he did, the words were simple. So simple that no one else in the room even understood them. "Obsidian Wren," he said, his voice low and steady, like a stone sliding into place. "Prep gear." The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter or chatter had been. The others glanced at one another, brows furrowed, waiting for some explanation. But Elena froze. The brass cartridge in her hand felt like it had turned molten. Her pulse thundered in her ears, louder than the humming lights above. It had been years. Years since she had heard those words. A call sign buried under layers of secrecy, buried so deep that she'd convinced herself it would never surface again. Obsidian Wren. To the others, it was nonsense, a phrase that meant nothing. But to her, it was a key turning in a lock she had sealed tight. Slowly, she placed the round back on the table. Her fingers no longer moved with the calm patience they had a moment ago. They trembled, just slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. She looked up. The sergeant's face was unreadable, carved from years of command, his jaw rigid, his eyes holding the weight of something unspoken. He gave no further instruction, no explanation, just the nod, the faintest dip of his chin, one soldier to another. The room stayed still. One of the younger recruits whispered, "What did he just say?" But no one answered. Elena's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. The sound cracked through the silence like a rifle report. She had spent years pretending to be invisible, years letting herself be dismissed as the quiet one, the obsessive one, the one who cared too much about defective links and dented casings. But in a single moment, the walls she had built around herself collapsed. Her movements changed. No longer the bent posture of someone chained to a work table. She straightened, shoulders squaring, a controlled steadiness filling her stance. The tremor in her hand stilled. Precision turned into readiness. Prep gear. The words echoed in her mind. She knew what they meant. Knew that somewhere, beyond the concrete walls of the armory, something had shifted. An operation was moving. Something dangerous. Something that required more than just another soldier. It required her. She didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, She opened the crate beside her and pulled out the reinforced vest she hadn't touched in months. The straps tightened across her chest with a sound that made the younger recruits flinch. They had never seen her wear it. To them, she was just the woman at the table, the one who never raised her voice, the one who never left the prep room. But now, as she cinched the vest and secured the buckles, their eyes followed her every move. "What's going on?" one of them whispered, but no one had the courage to repeat it louder. Elena reached for her sidearm next. The weight was familiar, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She slid the magazine home with a crisp motion, checked the chamber, then holstered it without hesitation. Her body remembered, even after all this time. Every movement was muscle memory, every adjustment precise, efficient. The sergeant didn't look away. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched, his expression hard, as if measuring her readiness. When she finally met his eyes, she saw it. Not doubt, not command, but recognition. The kind that said, "Yes, you're still who you were trained to be." And with that recognition came a wave of clarity. She wasn't the same 21-year-old who had been recruited under that call sign. She was older now, 28, more weathered, more deliberate. She had carried her training into every unnoticed detail of her life, even into the tedious work of inspecting ammo belts. She had never stopped being Obsidian Wren. She had only been waiting. The recruits whispered again, louder this time. "What is she doing? Why is she gearing up?" They looked at one another for answers, but none came. The truth was simple. They didn't know who Elena Marquez really was. They never had. The sergeant finally broke the silence, his voice like gravel. Orders came through. "It's time." That was all he said. No explanations. No details. But Elena understood. That was all she needed. Her eyes swept the room once, catching the stares of the young soldiers who had mocked her patience, who had laughed at her seriousness. They didn't laugh now. They didn't even breathe. They watched her, wide-eyed, as if seeing her for the first time. In that silence, Elena felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones. This was the turning point. The end of the quiet anonymity she had built around herself. The beginning of something she had known. Deep down, she would never escape. Obsidian Wren. She inhaled, steady, controlled. Then she reached for the ammo belts she had just finished inspecting, her own hands having ensured every link was flawless. She slung them over her shoulder, their weight both familiar and new. This was no longer about defect checks or tedious detail. This was activation. This was transformation. And as she prepared to follow the sergeant into the unknown, the younger soldiers finally understood. The quiet woman they had ignored wasn't just part of their unit. She was something else entirely. Something they weren't ready to comprehend. The air outside the armory was thick with night. The floodlights along the perimeter cut pale beams across the asphalt, painting long shadows of the soldiers as they assembled. Boots scuffed in uneven rhythm, rifles clutched a little too tight. The younger recruits shifted nervously, their earlier bravado gone. Their voices hushed as they tried to guess what was happening. Elena stood among them, but apart. The ammo belts she had inspected with endless patience were now coiled across her shoulder like serpents of steel and brass. The reinforced vest hugged her chest, her sidearm heavy against her thigh, her posture tall and unyielding. For years, she had been a shadow at the table. Now, she was something else entirely. The sergeant moved down the line, his eyes cold, his words clipped as he handed out final checks. But when he stopped in front of her, he didn't bark orders. He didn't tell her to fall in line. He held her gaze, and then, with the same gravity he'd used to awaken her call sign, he said, "You lead the advance. They'll follow you." The words hung in the air, heavy enough to silence every whisper. The recruits blinked, disbelief rippling through them. Her? The one who spent hours bent over belts of ammunition. The one they had teased for being too meticulous, too quiet? Their faces said what they didn't dare speak. She can't be the one in charge. But Elena didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once, her expression unreadable, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. Inside, her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the recognition of inevitability. This was what she had been training for, in silence, in secrecy, for all those years. The recruits shifted uneasily, but the sergeant didn't repeat himself. His word was law, and his trust was clear. If he said Obsidian Wren would lead, then that was the end of it. Elena turned to face them, her eyes sweeping across the uncertain faces. She saw the doubt, the hesitation, the fragile edge of fear, and she recognized it, not because she shared it, but because she remembered what it was like to feel it for the first time. Her voice, when it came, was calm, even, carrying a weight that silenced them further. Stay tight. Trust your gear. Trust the work that's been done. You'll move when I move. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't meant to inspire. But the steadiness in her tone, the certainty in her command, did more for them than any rallying cry. Some of the recruits straightened, their shoulders squaring as if pulled up by invisible strings. They didn't know her, but they felt something undeniable. She was in control. The gates creaked open, the metallic groan rolling into the night like thunder. Beyond the perimeter, darkness stretched, thick and endless, broken only by the faint outline of terrain ahead. The mission details hadn't been spoken aloud, not to the recruits, anyway. But Elena didn't need them. She understood. This was not training. This was not routine. This was real. As they moved forward, boots falling into rhythm behind her, she felt the shift inside herself. For years, she had been patient, methodical, overlooked. Every dented casing, every crooked link she had caught and corrected had been practiced for this. The discipline, the silence, the obsession with detail, it all crystallized into a singular truth. She was ready. The recruits followed, their nervousness tempered by her calm. The sergeant marched behind, watching, measuring, but not interfering. This was her operation now. Her lead. One recruit, barely 20, glanced at her as they advanced, his face pale in the floodlight's glow. "Why you?" he whispered before he could stop himself. She didn't break stride. "Because when you were laughing," she said quietly, "I was preparing." The words cut through him, through all of them. They understood now. She hadn't been obsessive, or strange, or too serious. She had been readying herself for the day the call sign would return, the day when lives depended on work no one else thought mattered. They continued, the night swallowing them step by step. The mission ahead was unknown to the recruits, but to Elena, it didn't matter. What mattered was the weight of command pressing into her shoulders, the trust of the sergeant behind her, and the eyes of those who would now follow her lead. Every beat of her heart felt sharper, more deliberate. She remembered her father's words. Long ago, there are the ones who fire the rounds, and the ones who make sure they can be fired. Tonight, she was both, the meticulous guardian of details and the point of the spear. As they crossed into the dark, Elena Marquez shed the last of the invisibility she had worn for years. She was no longer just the quiet woman at the armory table, the one mocked for caring too much. She was Obsidian Wren, activated, leading, carrying with her the weight of every unnoticed hour she had spent preparing for this exact moment. And the recruits who followed, wide-eyed, uncertain, but steadied by her presence, would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The night they learned that heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes, they emerge from the shadows, from the quiet corners, from the hands that never stopped working. The sergeant's final words echoed in her mind as the darkness swallowed their formation whole. "You lead the advance. They'll follow you." And they did.